It's a strange thing, isn't it? How you can go through your whole life believing certain things are reality so solid you'd bet your life on it. Then, one event, sometimes just a single night, smashes that foundation into a million pieces. That's what this story is about. It's about the night the world I thought I knew cracked open, and something else, something old and cold, seeped through. You see, I never believed in ghosts or spirits. Not really. That was stuff for movies and campfire stories, you know? Just a bit of fun to give you a shiver. But an abandoned hospital, a place where you could almost feel the pain and fear soaked into the walls, that changed everything for me. It started with things I could almost brush off, weird whispers you could barely hear, lights that flickered like they had a mind of their own. But it didn't stop there. It got worse, much worse, until I was face to face with something that was absolutely, terrifyingly not from this world. And it left its mark on me, a kind of scar on my soul that I still feel. This isn't just a story, it's me trying to explain the terror I went through, a terror that completely changed how I see reality. Before that night, if you'd asked me about ghosts, I probably would have laughed, maybe even rolled my eyes a bit. I was a hardcore skeptic, almost aggressively so. To me, the world ran on logic and physics, a complicated machine, sure, but one you could understand. Anything outside of that? Misunderstanding, trick of the light, or someone just making it up. I'd listen to friends tell their paranormal stories with this patient, kind of patronizing smile, always ready with a rational explanation. It wasn't me trying to be a jerk. I genuinely couldn't get my head around a reality where that stuff was real. My world was neat, predictable. The unknown was just stuff science hadn't gotten around to explaining yet. Old St. Augustine's Hospital had been a local legend for as long as I could remember. It sat on a hill overlooking town, its silhouette like a jagged tear in the skyline, especially around dusk. Abandoned for decades, it was this huge, decaying monument to suffering. Stories stuck to it like ivy, tales of tormented patients, shadowy figures in windows, weird noises drifting down the hill on quiet nights. Local kids used it as a creepy playground, a place to prove how brave they were. To me, it was just a rundown building, a symbol of bad town planning and time marching on. The stories, I figured, were just overactive imaginations, fed by how unsettling a place like that naturally is. I mean, hospitals, even working ones, can feel heavy, right? An abandoned one. Of course, people would project their fears onto it. The idea to go there wasn't even mine at first. It was a Friday night, late October, the air getting that crisp chill that means winter's coming. A bunch of us were hanging out, and with Halloween around the corner, the conversation naturally turned to local ghost stories. St. Augustine's, of course, took center stage. Liam, always the one to stir things up, loved a good dare. He zeroed in on me. He knew my views on the paranormal. He'd heard my dismissive explanations 100 times. "All right, Mr. Rational," he said with this grin. "If it's all just stories, then you wouldn't mind spending a few hours in St. Augustine's tonight, would you? Alone." The challenge just hung there. It wasn't mean-spirited, more like a playful jab at my stubborn skepticism. My other friends chimed in, a mix of excitement and pretend concern in their voices. Part of me wanted to say no, that it was a waste of time, that I had better things to do than wander around a dusty, unsafe ruin. But another part of me, a stubborn, maybe even arrogant part, felt a little prickle. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was wanting to definitively prove my point, not just to them but to myself, to reaffirm the solid, logical world I lived in. "Why not?" I heard myself say, the words sounding way more confident than I suddenly felt. "It's just an old building. What's there to be scared of?" Even as I said it, a tiny, almost unnoticeable shiver of unease, something I'd later realize was a gut warning, flickered deep inside me. I brushed it off, of course. Just the power of suggestion, the spooky vibe of the conversation. The plan was simple. They'd drop me off around midnight. I'd go in, explore for a couple of hours, and they'd pick me up. No theatrics, no trying to scare me more. Just me, the abandoned hospital, and my unshakable belief in the mundane. I grabbed a powerful flashlight, checked the batteries. A practical thought, nothing more. I told myself it was a chance to gather evidence for my skepticism, to see how an environment like that could play tricks on your mind. I wasn't looking for ghosts, I was looking for the explanations behind ghost stories. The irony, looking back, is almost too much. I was so focused on finding the ordinary that I was totally unprepared for it to be completely absent. My own deep-seated fear, one I hadn't even admitted to myself, was the fear of the irrational, the fear of my carefully built worldview crumbling. That night, St. Augustine's wasn't just a setting. It was about to become a character in my story, a nasty one at that, ready to exploit that unacknowledged dread. The drive up to St. Augustine's was pretty quiet. My friends, maybe sensing my bravado was slipping or just respecting the solo mission I'd given myself, didn't say much. The hospital loomed larger with every curve of the winding road, its dark windows like empty eyes staring into the night. The moon was just a sliver, not giving off much light, and the skeletal branches of the trees around it clawed at the starless sky. It was the perfect cliché of a haunted place, and I almost scoffed at how predictable it all looked. They pulled up to the rusty main gates, which were barely hanging on. "You sure about this?" Sarah asked, her voice softer now, genuine concern in her tone. I gave a quick nod, trying to look casual even though I wasn't entirely feeling it. "I'll be fine. It's an adventure." I stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound for a moment. The air was colder up here, carrying the smell of damp earth and decay. They wished me luck, their voices a little too bright, and then their taillights disappeared down the hill, leaving me in this heavy silence, a silence that felt like it was pressing in from every direction. The main entrance was a gaping black hole of shadows. The heavy oak doors were long gone, probably vandalized or just rotted away. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, lighting up a reception area that looked like a bomb had gone off. Dust lay thick as a blanket over overturned furniture, scattered papers yellowed with age, and what was left of a welcome desk. The smell was stronger here, a sickly mix of mildew, stale air, and something else, something faintly medicinal and weirdly organic. For the first half hour, it was exactly what I expected. Eerily quiet. Yes, unsettling because of how run down it was. Absolutely, but nothing more. I moved slowly, carefully, my flashlight beam dancing across peeling paint, rusted gurneys left in hallways, and doorways leading to rooms full of God knows what debris. I even talked out loud sometimes, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness, narrating what I saw like I was making a documentary for myself. Cracked linoleum floor, water damage on the ceiling, probably asbestos everywhere. It was a way to keep my cool, to reinforce the normalcy I was determined to find. Then came the first whisper. I was in what looked like an old administrative wing, a long corridor lined with small offices. I'd stopped to look at a ledger I found on a decaying desk, its pages stuck together by dampness, when I heard it. A sound so faint, so quick, I almost dismissed it as the wind or a rat scurrying in the walls. It was like a sigh, a breath exhaled very close to my ear. I froze, flashlight aimed at the ledger. My heart gave a single hard thump. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking a little. Silence answered, just the heavy, oppressive silence of the abandoned hospital. I told myself it was nothing. An auditory illusion, the building settling. My own mind, already on edge because of the setting and why I was there, playing tricks on me. Rational, logical. I took a deep breath and kept going. A little faster now, maybe. But that little seed of unease had been planted. My senses felt sharper. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle from somewhere unseen, now seemed like it could mean something. A few minutes later, in a larger room that might have been a common area or a waiting room, the lights flickered. Not my flashlight, but the overhead fixtures. Ancient, dust-covered globes I wouldn't have thought could hold any charge. They didn't just flicker, they pulsed, a dim, sickly orange glow that lasted for a few seconds before dying again. I stopped dead. This was harder to dismiss. There was no power to this building, not for decades. I scanned the ceiling, my light tracing the corroded wiring. Loose connection? A stray surge from some forgotten generator? My mind scrambled for an explanation. but the logic felt forced, thin. That feeling of being watched, a classic ghost story trope, started to creep over me. It wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a physical sensation, like cold fingers tracing my spine. I turned in a slow circle, sweeping my flashlight beam across the room, half expecting to see someone, something, standing in the shadows. There was nothing but decay and desolation. Yet, the air felt different, charged, like the very atoms were vibrating with some unseen energy. The silence after the flickering lights was heavier, more loaded than before. Those first unsettling things, the whisper, the flickering lights, were sneaky. They were just subtle enough that you could still try to doubt them, to desperately cling to some rational explanation. But the hospital, it seemed, wasn't satisfied with just suggestions. It was as if my skepticism was a challenge, and whatever unseen forces were in those walls were now determined to break it down, piece by piece. I pushed deeper into the building, pulled by a morbid curiosity that was quickly taking over my earlier confidence. Maybe it was a subconscious need to confront whatever was happening, to understand it, or to debunk it once and for all. I found myself in what was clearly a patient wing. Small, identical rooms lined a corridor that seemed to go on forever, their doors either hanging open or missing altogether. The atmosphere here felt different, heavier, filled with a sense of leftover suffering that was almost something you could touch. It was the kind of place where you instinctively lowered your voice, even if you were alone. It was in one of these rooms that the next thing happened. I shone my light into a cramped space, revealing a rusted bed frame, a single, overturned metal chair, and peeling wallpaper with faded, cheerful flowers, a cruel joke in such a grim place. As I was about to move on, a small metallic clang echoed from the far corner of the room behind the bed. It wasn't loud, but in the deep silence it sounded like a gunshot. My breath caught. I swept the beam towards the sound. Nothing. Just shadows and dust. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice now noticeably shaky. Again, only silence, but this time the silence felt attentive. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the huge emptiness. I took a hesitant step into the room, then another, my flashlight beam quivering slightly in my hand. I had to know. I had to see. I edged around the bed frame. There, on the floor, was a small, tarnished metal cup, the kind that might have held pills. It was lying on its side as if it had just been knocked over. I stared at it. Could it have fallen? Maybe a draft? A vibration from my own footsteps? But the air was still, and I had been moving carefully. It seemed too precise, too deliberate. As I watched, a chill, a pocket of intense cold, surrounded me. It was a stark contrast to the normal temperature of the room, which was just cool and damp. This was a biting, unnatural cold that seemed to seep into my bones, making me shiver uncontrollably. My breath plumed in front of me, visible in the flashlight beam. The logical part of my brain, already struggling, had no explanation for this. It was as if an icy presence had just passed through me, or maybe was standing right beside me. I backed out of the room slowly, never taking my eyes off the corner where the cup lay. The cold vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving me shaken, my skin clammy. My internal monologue of rationalization was getting fainter, drowned out by a rising tide of raw fear. I was no longer an observer. I felt like prey. The hospital wasn't just bricks and mortar anymore. It was an entity, and it was aware of me. The whispers started again, more persistent this time. Not just a single sigh, but a chorus of faint, indistinct murmurs, seeming to come from all directions at once, yet from nowhere in particular. They were too low to make out any words, but the sound itself was deeply unsettling. A hissing, rustling chorus that felt like it was slithering just beneath the edge of my understanding. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it made no difference. The sounds seemed to be coming from inside my own head, or maybe they were carried on a frequency my ears weren't meant to pick up, but my brain somehow did. I began to feel a growing sense of isolation, not just physical, but emotional and psychological. Who would believe this? How could I even describe it in a way that wouldn't sound crazy? My carefully constructed reality was starting to fray at the edges, and the patterns I saw were no longer those of logic but of a creeping, invasive dread. I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, my flashlight beam jerking nervously from shadow to shadow. Every darkened doorway seemed to hide a watching presence. Every rustle of debris sounded like a footstep. My attempts to rationalize were becoming frantic, desperate. It's the wind. It's old pipes. My mind is playing tricks. But the reassurances rang hollow even to myself. The evidence of something inexplicable was mounting, and with it, a terrifying sense of vulnerability. I was alone, deep inside a place that felt increasingly hostile, and the rules I had always lived by no longer seemed to apply. The escalation was relentless. Each new thing chipped away another piece of my skepticism, replacing it with a cold, gut-wrenching fear. I wasn't exploring out of curiosity or to debunk things anymore. I was moving because I didn't know what else to do. Part of me screamed to turn around, to run back to the entrance and wait for my friends, to escape the oppressive atmosphere of St. Augustine's. But another, darker, more compelling force seemed to keep me there, or maybe pushed me forward. It was as if the hospital itself was a living labyrinth, and I was being drawn inevitably towards its center, towards some unknown, horrifying revelation. I stumbled into what must have been a surgical theater. The room was larger than others, with a distinct tiered viewing gallery along one wall. In the center, beneath a massive rusted operating lamp, was the unmistakable shape of an operating table, still draped with a tattered, stained sheet. The air in this room was thick, heavy, and carried a metallic, coppery scent that made my stomach churn. It was the smell of old blood, faint but undeniable. My flashlight beam lingered on the operating table. I imagined the countless procedures done there, the lives saved, the lives lost. The sheer concentration of human emotion, fear, pain, hope, despair, that must have soaked this very spot was overwhelming. I felt a profound sadness and anguish settle over me, an emotional residue that seemed to cling to the air itself. Then a sound cut through the oppressive stillness, a low moan. Not a whisper this time, not an indistinct murmur, but a clear, guttural sound of suffering. It seemed to come from the direction of the operating table. My blood turned to ice. Every nerve ending in my body screamed. My light snapped towards the table, my hand shaking so violently the beam danced erratically. The sheet on the table was undisturbed. There was nothing there. "Who's there?" I choked out, my voice barely a whisper. My throat felt tight, constricted. The moan came again, longer this time, laced with an incredible despair. It was a sound that bypassed your ears and resonated directly in your soul, a sound of pure, raw agony. It was undeniably human, yet there was an edge to it, a hollowness that spoke of something beyond human suffering. I wanted to run. God, how I wanted to run. My legs felt like lead, yet every instinct shrieked for me to get out. But I was frozen, transfixed by a terror so profound it was paralyzing. And then, I felt it. A touch. Something cold and dry, like old leather, brushed against the back of my hand. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned, a strangled cry escaping my lips. I spun around, sweeping the flashlight beam wildly. Nothing. No one. The room was empty, yet it felt suffocatingly crowded. The moaning stopped. The silence that followed was worse, if that was even possible. It was a silence filled with an unspoken promise of horror. My breathing was ragged, shallow. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. This wasn't about subtle disturbances or fleeting sensations anymore. This was direct. This was personal. This was contact. The rationalizations were gone, obliterated. There was no wind that could moan like that. There were no old pipes that could touch my hand with such distinct, chilling intent. I was confronting something that defied every law of nature I held dear, something that should not, could not, exist. The point of no return had been crossed. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that I was not alone in that abandoned hospital. And whatever was there with me was not friendly. It was aware, it was capable of interaction, and it seemed to be getting some sick pleasure from my growing terror. The thought of escape was still there, but it was now mixed with a dreadful feeling that the hospital, or the things in it, might not be willing to let me go. The playful dare had curdled into a fight for my sanity, and possibly for something more. The surgical theater had become a trap. The air was thick with a malevolence that was almost visible, a shimmering distortion in the beam of my flashlight. The touch, the moan, these were just the warm-up I sensed for something far worse. My mind, stripped of its logical defenses, was now a raw, exposed nerve, waiting for the next wave of terror with an almost unbearable intensity. I had to get out of that room, but my feet seemed glued to the spot, my muscles locked by a paralyzing fear. It started with the operating lamp directly above the table. The huge, multifaceted metal dome began to sway, just a little at first, then with more and more momentum. A low, groaning creak came with each swing, the sound of rusted metal protesting under some unseen force. My eyes were fixed on it, wide with disbelief and horror. There was no draft in the room capable of moving something so heavy. It swung higher and higher, casting distorted, dancing shadows that writhed across the walls like grotesque figures. The light from my flashlight glinted off its polished surfaces, creating disorienting flashes. Then the temperature plummeted again, but this time it was a crushing, suffocating cold, far more intense than before. It stole the breath from my lungs, and a painful ache spread through my chest. I could see my breath exploding in ragged clouds in front of me. The metallic scent of old blood intensified, now mixed with another even more repulsive odor, the smell of decay, of rot, not of the building, but of flesh. My stomach heaved, and I fought back a wave of nausea. A sound began to form out of the oppressive silence, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate in the very air around me. It wasn't human. Not entirely. There was a bestial quality to it, filled with a primal rage that made the hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stand on end. It grew louder, closer, seeming to come from the shadows clustered around the operating table. My flashlight beam, though trembling violently in my grip, instinctively moved towards the source of the sound. And then I saw it. It wasn't a full-bodied apparition, not like in the movies. It was something far more terrifying because it was both there and not there, a horrifying paradox. At first, it was just a deepening of the shadows, a patch of darkness near the base of the operating table that was blacker than the surrounding gloom. Then, the darkness began to congeal, to take on a vague, shifting form. It was tall, unnaturally so, and gaunt, its limbs too long, its proportions subtly wrong in a way that was deeply disturbing to look at. There were no discernible features, no face, just a shifting column of pure, absolute blackness that seemed to suck all light into it. Yet, I felt an intelligence there, a malevolent awareness focused entirely on me. The growling intensified, morphing into a rasping, choked sound, as if something were trying to speak through a throat ruined by screaming or decay. And then, words did begin to form, not clearly audible, but more like an impression, a vile whisper that bypassed my ears and burrowed directly into my mind. "Get out," it seemed to hiss, the mental voice dripping with contempt and a terrifying hunger. But it wasn't a warning to leave. It felt like a command to expose myself further, a taunt. Then it moved. Not like a physical being, but like smoke, or a stain spreading across the floor, impossibly fast. It flowed towards me, and with its approach came an overwhelming wave of despair and terror, so potent it brought me to my knees. My flashlight clattered to the floor, its beam spinning crazily, plunging the room into a chaotic dance of light and shadow before settling on a patch of stained wall. I was in near darkness, save for the dim, ambient light filtering from the distant moon through grimy windows. I scrambled backwards, crab-walking desperately, my hands scraping against the rough, cold floor. The thing was upon me, not physically touching me, but its presence was a crushing weight, a suffocating blanket of pure, unadulterated evil. The cold was so intense it burned, and the stench was unbearable. I could feel its attention, like a physical pressure against my skin, against my very soul. It felt like it was trying to peel away my sanity, layer by layer. A new sound emerged, a series of sharp, distinct raps coming from the operating table itself. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, deliberate, methodical, like fingernails on steel. And then a sound that would haunt my nightmares for years to come, a wet, tearing sound, followed by a soft, heavy thud, as if something had been dropped onto the metal surface of the table. I couldn't see what it was. I didn't want to see. My mind was screaming a torrent of pure, undiluted terror. This was it. This was the confrontation. This was the something not of this world. And it was more horrifying than anything I could have ever imagined. My skepticism hadn't just been challenged, it had been brutally murdered, dismembered, and left to rot in the suffocating darkness of that room. I felt a tearing sensation within myself, as if something vital was being ripped away. I wasn't just scared. I felt like I was dissolving, my identity, my sense of self, being consumed by the overwhelming horror. The hissing voice came again, closer this time, as if the formless blackness was leaning right over me. You stay. It wasn't a request. It was a pronouncement of doom. I knew with a chilling certainty that went beyond fear, that if I didn't get out of there, if I didn't break free from whatever paralyzing spell held me, I would be lost. Not just physically harmed, but lost in a way that meant my very essence would be consumed by this place and the thing that inhabited it. A primal surge of adrenaline, born from the absolute certainty I was about to be annihilated, finally broke through the paralysis. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was pure, unadulterated survival instinct. With a strangled sob, a sound I barely recognized as my own, I lunged for where I thought my flashlight had fallen. My hand closed around its metallic casing, and with a desperate flick of the switch, the beam, blessedly, sprang to life. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking so violently I could barely stand. The beam of the flashlight cut through the oppressive darkness, landing squarely on the shifting black mass that was still advancing, still exuding that soul-crushing cold and malevolence. Seeing it even in its horrifying formlessness somehow solidified its reality, and weirdly, gave me a target for my terror, a direction for my flight. I didn't look back at the operating table. I didn't dare. The memory of the tearing sound, the soft thud, was seared into my brain. I turned and ran, blindly, fueled by a terror that was beyond anything I had ever experienced or could have conceived. I blundered out of the surgical theater, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps, my heart threatening to explode in my chest. The corridors that had seemed merely eerie before were now a nightmarish labyrinth. Every shadow seemed to leap out at me. Every sound, the skittering of unseen creatures, the groan of the decaying building, amplified my fear, convinced me that the entity from the operating room was right behind me, its cold breath on my neck. The whispers seemed to follow me, no longer just indistinct murmurs, but now laced with a mocking, triumphant quality. I didn't know which way I was going. I had lost all sense of direction in my panic. I crashed into unseen obstacles, stumbled over debris, my flashlight beam waving frantically, painting streaks of light on the decaying walls. My only thought was escape, to get out of this accursed place, to reach the outside world, the sane world. Rooms blurred past, patient rooms, offices, what might have been a dispensary, its shelves bare, its floor littered with broken glass. Each doorway was a potential new horror, each darkened corner, a hiding place for unspeakable things. I could still feel the oppressive cold, though it was less intense now that I was moving away from the surgical theater. Or perhaps my terror was so overwhelming it was simply numbing my other senses. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of blind, panicked flight, I recognized a landmark, the dilapidated reception area near the main entrance. The gaping black hole of the doorway, which had seemed so menacing when I arrived, now looked like a beacon of salvation. With a final burst of speed, I launched myself through the opening out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached the rusted main gates, where my friends were supposed to pick me up. I collapsed there, gasping for breath, my body trembling uncontrollably, tears of terror and relief streaming down my face. The sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the distant rustle of leaves, were the most beautiful things I had ever heard. They were normal. They were real. I looked back at the hulking silhouette of St. Augustine's Hospital. Its darkened windows seemed to stare back at me with a knowing, malevolent gaze. It stood there, a silent, brooding testament to the horrors it contained. Horrors I had now personally witnessed. The experience had been so intense, so profoundly terrifying, that it felt like a physical assault. My mind struggled to process what had just happened, to reconcile the impossible things I had seen and felt with the ordered reality I had always known. But there was no reconciliation possible. The hospital had ripped a hole in my world. My friends found me there a short while later, huddled by the gates, shivering, incoherent. I tried to tell them what happened, but the words wouldn't come out right. They were a jumbled mess of fear and disbelief, punctuated by uncontrollable shudders. They saw the state I was in, pale, wide-eyed, genuinely terrified, and their playful teasing from earlier vanished, replaced by a shocked concern. They didn't press me for details on the drive back, for which I was immensely grateful. I don't think I could have articulated the sheer horror of it all, not then. In the days and weeks that followed, the full impact of that night began to settle in. Sleep became a nightly battle against recurring nightmares, vivid replays of the shifting blackness, the guttural growls, the chilling touch, the horrifying sounds in the surgical theater. The world, which had once seemed so solid and predictable, now felt fragile, thin, with dark and terrifying possibilities lurking just beneath the surface. My staunch skepticism was gone, replaced by a reluctant, terrified belief in things I couldn't see or understand, things that science had no explanation for. That night in St. Augustine's didn't just change my mind. It rewired my brain, altered my perception of reality itself. The experience left an indelible scar. It's not a physical wound, but something deeper, a persistent unease that settled into the core of my being. I became jumpier, more attuned to the subtle shifts in atmosphere, the unexplained noises that I would have once dismissed without a second thought. Certain places, particularly old, abandoned buildings, now fill me with a profound sense of dread. The memory of that suffocating cold, that malevolent presence, is never far away. I've never gone back to St. Augustine's Hospital. I don't think I ever could. Sometimes I wonder about the thing I encountered there. What was it? The tortured spirit of a former patient? Something older, darker, drawn to the accumulated misery of the place? I have no answers, only the chilling certainty of its existence and its profound malice. There are unanswered questions that still haunt me. What was on that operating table? What would have happened if I hadn't managed to escape? These are questions I try not to dwell on, for fear of where those thoughts might lead. That encounter in the abandoned hospital stripped away my comfortable illusions and forced me to confront a reality far more terrifying and mysterious than I could have ever imagined. I learned that night that there are indeed things in this world, or perhaps beyond it, that defy rational explanation, things that are ancient, powerful, and sometimes deeply hostile. It's a terrifying knowledge to carry, a constant reminder that the veil between our world and something else is terrifyingly thin. And sometimes, if you're not careful, or if you're just unlucky, you can stumble right through it. I went into that hospital a skeptic, armed with logic and reason. I came out a believer, forever marked by an encounter with sheer unadulterated terror. If you've had an experience that shattered your reality, something you can't explain but know was real, I'd be interested to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories that delve into the unsettling and the unexplained, consider subscribing. Sometimes knowing you're not alone in these experiences is the only comfort we have. Stay safe and perhaps be a little more cautious about the shadows than I was.